I still remember the way my cousin Ethan's face drained of color when the lawyer slid that final document across the polished mahogany table. There were 6 of us cousins seated around the conference room, each of us pretending not to sweat under the slow-moving ceiling fan, but Ethan had been the loudest, the most arrogant, the one who spent months ridiculing me for what he called babysitting the old man. But when the truth came out, when the trust was opened, and the terms were revealed, Ethan couldn't even form words. He just stared at me, lips parted, disbelief boiling under his skin like something volcanic and unstable. If silence can make a sound, that room was filled with it. The lawyer, Mr. Hastings, tapped the page with a calm finger. As designated trustee, he said, looking straight at me, you have full authority to enact these instructions. No disbursements, no asset transfers, no property rights may occur without your approval. My approval. Ethan blinked twice, then 3 times, as if trying to wake himself from a dream he did not like. A dream in which I, the cousin he'd mocked for years, the woman he assumed was soft, obedient, and easy to dismiss, now stood between him and the inheritance he'd practically spent in his head already. He choked out the first thing his stunned ego could grasp. This has to be a mistake. It wasn't. I watched him swallow his pride in that suffocating room, and for the first time in decades, I didn't look away. I held his gaze until he flinched. That was the moment he understood. Every cruel joke, every whispered insult, every smirk he'd worn while calling me Grandpa's pet, had led us to this exact point. But justice didn't begin in that conference room. It started months earlier, long before Grandpa died, back when family felt like something fragile, and betrayal was still only a faint tremor beneath the surface. It began with quiet visits to Grandpa's house. Visits Ethan despised. Visits he mocked. Visits he said were pathetic and pointless, because, in his words, the old man barely remembers anything anymore. But he remembered. He remembered everything. And Grandpa had plans. Plans he only shared with one person. Me. The story of how I became the trustee, how the truth unraveled, and how my cousin's arrogance built the perfect trap for his own downfall is something I never expected to tell. But that day in the conference room, with everyone staring at me, I realized the story wasn't just mine. It belonged to every person who's ever been dismissed for being quiet. Every caregiver who's been underestimated. Every woman who's been told she was too soft to stand up for herself. Ethan shifted in his seat, sweat gathering at the edge of his hairline, and whispered, "You can't do this, Margaret." But I could. And I did. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Grandpa had given me more than authority. He had given me the truth. And the truth was about to tear our family wide open. Before the lawyer could continue, Ethan leaned forward, eyes narrow, voice trembling with panic. "What exactly," he demanded, "did Grandpa put in that trust?" I took a slow breath, steady and deliberate. This, right here, was the moment everything turned. And Ethan had no idea what was coming next. "My name is Margaret Ellison, and I'm 63 years old. I'm a retired school administrator, a widow of 12 years, and someone who has spent most of her adulthood trying to keep the peace in a family that seems allergic to gratitude. I'm not dramatic by nature. I don't raise my voice. I don't storm out of rooms. I don't slam doors. Life has humbled me enough times to teach me that anger burns fast, but clarity burns long. After my husband died, I learned that caring for someone at the end of their life rearranges your soul. It changes what you value, what you fear, and what you refuse to tolerate anymore. So when Grandpa began declining, mind still sharp but body growing frail, I stepped in without hesitation. He lived alone in the big house on Willow Creek Road, a property that had been in our family for nearly a century. My cousins saw it as an investment, a future sale, a check waiting to be cashed. But I saw something they didn't: a man who had lived through war, loss, economic hardship, and the raising of 3 generations. A man who deserved dignity, not impatience. I visited 3 times a week. Sometimes more. I brought groceries, cooked, made sure he took his medication, helped him organize his paperwork, helped him handle the bills he didn't trust online services to manage. I listened to his stories, even the ones I'd heard 100 times, because storytelling was how he kept himself grounded. And I suppose it was during those soft afternoon hours, sunlight drifting across the living room carpet, that our bond deepened in a way my cousins could never understand. They visited on holidays. I visited on days that mattered. But in families like ours, doing the right thing doesn't earn appreciation. It earns suspicion. She's positioning herself. Ethan once told my cousin Leah over a Thanksgiving dinner I wasn't invited to, something I heard about later, of course, because gossip moves faster than goodwill. She's trying to get something from him. Nobody spends that much time with Grandpa without an agenda. It was always like that. If I showed kindness, they assumed manipulation. If I stayed quiet, they assumed weakness. If I stayed consistent, they assumed cunning. What they didn't know was that Grandpa had reached out to me first. One rainy afternoon 2 years before he passed, he placed a stack of documents on the dining table, covered by a blue cloth napkin. His hands trembled, not from fear but from determination. "Margaret," he said, "I need you to help me with something important. And I need someone I can trust." I didn't know then where that road would lead. I didn't know the battles I'd face. I certainly didn't know that my cousin's ridicule, his sarcastic jabs about me playing nurse, would one day twist into something far uglier, something that would test every ounce of composure I had. But I agreed. And that decision set everything into motion. Before Grandpa could explain the documents, the phone rang. He looked at me with an expression I would only understand much later. "We'll continue this after," he said. But we didn't. Because what happened next shifted our family forever. Family, in theory, is a soft place to land. In practice, ours was a tightrope stretched over a canyon. One wrong word, one misunderstood glance, and someone would fall into a pit of grudges so deep we'd forget how the argument even started. My mother used to say, "Ellisons don't talk about problems, we just decorate them and call it tradition." She wasn't wrong. After Grandpa lost my grandmother 20 years ago, the cousins drifted into predictable roles. Ethan became the ambitious one, the self-declared heir to whatever financial legacy the family still carried. He loved telling people he was next in line, as though Grandpa were a crown and the rest of us were merely attendees at his coronation. Leah, gentle but easily influenced, tended to absorb whatever Ethan said, especially when it came to assessing other people's motives. She wasn't unkind, just deeply afraid of conflict. She floated wherever the stronger current carried her. My younger cousin Riley kept his distance from all of us. He lived 3 towns away, worked on boats for a living, and rarely attended family gatherings. I always liked Riley. Unlike Ethan, he didn't pretend that absence was a form of superiority. And then there was me. The oldest cousin. The widow. The one who had stepped away from full-time work to care for a dying husband and, later, a declining grandfather. This, to Ethan, meant I had nothing better to do. As though caregiving came from a lack of opportunities rather than an excess of heart. When Grandpa began needing more help, the family dynamic shifted in a way that exposed the cracks we'd all ignored for years. Every decision, who would take him to appointments, who would check on him during storms, who would help manage his accounts, landed in my lap. Not because my cousins couldn't help, but because they simply didn't. They always had convenient excuses. Ethan had business trips, which usually meant long weekends in wine country with his new girlfriend. Leah had overwhelming anxiety, though somehow that anxiety never prevented her from going on vacations. And Riley, though kind, lived far enough away that he wasn't a reliable, routine caregiver. I didn't resent it then. Not yet. I told myself I was doing what was right, what my husband would have wanted me to do. Honor the elders who once cared for us. But the more time I spent with Grandpa, the more I saw the weight he carried. The way he hesitated before asking for help, the way he apologized for the slowness of his steps, the way he sometimes stared at the family photos on the mantel as though trying to decide who still loved him. It broke something inside me to see him question his worth, especially when my cousins treated his needs as an inconvenience. One Sunday afternoon, as I was trimming his hedges and Ethan happened to pull into the driveway, he leaned out the window and called, "Putting in extra hours?" Gotta earn that inheritance somehow, huh? He laughed. Loudly. As though he'd said something clever. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, met his eyes and asked, "When was the last time you visited him?" He waved dismissively. "I'm busy, Margaret. Some of us have actual responsibilities." Then he drove away. Grandpa, who had heard the entire exchange from the porch, sighed. He forgets that respect is a responsibility too. I didn't know then how deeply that comment would echo through the months ahead, or how drastically Ethan's arrogance would shape the fate he eventually walked into. But the first true fracture in our family came later, born not from cruelty, but from suspicion. And it arrived in the form of a sealed envelope that Grandpa asked me to open only after he was gone. Inside that envelope was the truth none of us were prepared for. The envelope wasn't the betrayal. It was merely the explanation for it. The betrayal came 2 months before Grandpa died, on a bitterly cold evening when I arrived at his house to find him hunched over his dining table, eyes tight, jaw locked. The air smelled like burnt toast and worry. "What's wrong?" I asked. He slid a letter toward me, a notice from his bank that several automated payments had bounced. That alone made no sense. Grandpa's accounts were always stable. But when I logged into his online banking, the problem became clear. A series of transfers, small at first, then bold, had been made from one of his savings accounts over the previous 3 months. $500 here. $1,000 there. Then a shocking $4,800. The total drained was nearly $12,000. My chest tightened. "Did you authorize these?" He shook his head. "No. I can barely work the microwave. You think I'm moving money?" I scrolled through the transaction details. All transfers had been routed to an account under the name E. Ellison. My throat went dry. "Ethan." Grandpa closed his eyes as though the confirmation hurt more than the losses. I didn't want to believe it. There are moments when betrayal doesn't feel like a blow. It feels like a slow, cold seep into the bones. This was one of those moments. Why would he do this? I whispered, though the answer was obvious. Ethan believed he was entitled to Grandpa's money long before Grandpa was even gone. "He came by a few months ago," Grandpa murmured. "Said he was starting a business. Asked if I could lend him something to help him get on his feet. I told him I wanted to think about it." He shook his head. He must have taken that as permission to help himself. Part of me wanted to march out the door, call Ethan, demand answers, demand accountability. But Grandpa placed a hand on mine. "No confrontations," he said. "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because we need to understand the whole picture first. If he's taken this, who knows what else he's interfered with?" So we searched. Quietly. Methodically. And what we found was worse. Ethan hadn't only taken money. He had forged Grandpa's signature on 2 documents, one relating to the appraisal of the Willow Creek house, lowering the value dramatically, and another suggesting Grandpa intended to sell a portion of the land. It was enough to raise legal suspicion, and enough to make my blood turn to ice. When Grandpa realized the extent of it, he sank into his chair, hands trembling. "I raised him," he whispered. "Not alone, but close to it. After his father died. How could he do this to me?" I didn't have an answer. But Grandpa did something then that changed everything. He reached for the sealed envelope sitting on a small wooden tray beside him, the one he had always kept at arm's length. "It's time you know what's inside," he said. I hesitated. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "You're the only one I can trust with this." I broke the seal. Inside was a fully drafted trust, and a letter handwritten in Grandpa's steady, elegant script. Both documents were addressed to me. My heart pounded. "Grandpa, what is this?" He looked up with eyes full of resignation and resolve. "This, Margaret," he said softly, "is how we make things right." But making things right would require a truth Ethan was not ready to face. The trust documents were more detailed than anything I expected. Even before Ethan's theft, Grandpa had been crafting a plan, Not to punish, but to protect. Protect the house. Protect the land. Protect his legacy from the kind of entitlement that corrodes a family's foundation. I read the letter first. It began simply. My dear Margaret, if you are reading this, it means I am near the end, and I need you to carry out what I no longer can. The letter went on to explain that Grandpa had grown concerned about the family's behavior long before his health declined. He'd witnessed the way my cousins spoke about him, the way they joked about what they'd do once he was gone, the way they saw him as a stepping stone rather than a man. But he also saw my devotion. Not just in caregiving but in quiet consistency. He knew where to place his trust. At the bottom of the letter was a single request. Become trustee. Protect the assets until the truth comes out. Do not tell the others until the lawyer is present. I folded the letter with trembling hands. Grandpa, I whispered, I'll do whatever you need. He nodded with a sorrow that aged him further. It isn't vengeance, Margaret. It's stewardship. The next week became a careful, strategic investigation. With Grandpa's permission, I contacted an elder law attorney, Mr. Hastings, a man Grandpa trusted and who had helped draft the original trust framework years earlier. When I showed him the forged documents, his face hardened. This is serious. Forging a signature for financial gain can be prosecuted, especially if the victim is elderly. I expected him to recommend immediate legal action, but he shook his head. We need full documentation first. And we need to ensure your grandfather is protected, emotionally and medically. So we gathered evidence. A bank statement showing unauthorized transfers, a digital login records indicating access from an IP address tied to Ethan's home, a handwriting analysis comparing Grandpa's signature with the forged ones, security footage from the bank lobby showing Ethan at the ATM on days large withdrawals were made. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed a picture too ugly to ignore. During this period, Ethan never once visited Grandpa. Not to check on him. Not to offer help. Not even to maintain the pretense of concern. But he did call periodically, always with a question disguised as casual conversation. So, how's the old man doing? Has he mentioned anything about the house? Did he ever decide what he's doing with the land? It was almost laughable in its transparency. Meanwhile, Grandpa grew quieter. Not weaker, just more contemplative. One evening as I was helping him into bed, he said, "You know, Margaret, you're taking on a burden that should have been shared by everyone." "I don't see it as a burden." He smiled. "That's why I chose you." The forgery evidence was finalized 2 weeks before Grandpa died. Mr. Hastings told us we had enough to confront Ethan, enough to prevent him from touching another cent. But Grandpa shook his head. "Not yet. Let the trust speak for itself." "You want to wait until the reading?" I asked. He nodded. Ethan has spent years believing he's untouchable. Let reality introduce itself. I didn't fully understand then how powerful that moment would be, but Grandpa did. He always did. The plan was set. The documents were ready. The truth was coiled like a quiet storm. And then, in the early dawn of a winter morning, Grandpa passed peacefully in his sleep. The real reckoning began the moment I found him. Grief has a strange way of sharpening the senses. The morning Grandpa died, the house felt suspended in time, a stillness so profound that even the ticking clock seemed to hesitate. I sat beside his bed for nearly an hour, holding his hand, letting the warmth fade naturally. When I finally called the hospice nurse, she arrived with gentle efficiency. She touched my shoulder and said, "He went peacefully. That's a gift." I nodded, though my heart felt split wide open. After they took him, I stayed in the house. I made coffee. I walked from room to room. I memorized the smell of his wool blankets and the faint cedar of his dresser drawers. Then I sat at the dining table, the same place where he had revealed the truth of Ethan's betrayal. The envelope, the forged signatures, the trust, all of it lay where we'd last discussed it. This was the moment. The turning point. The place where grief met purpose. I took out the trust again and read the final page, the one Grandpa had stared at so intently the night he first showed it to me. Only Margaret may serve as trustee. Her judgment is final and cannot be contested without evidence of wrongdoing. Any beneficiary found to have manipulated, exploited, or stolen from me shall have their portion reduced or revoked entirely. He had written the last sentence by hand. I wiped a tear from my cheek and whispered, "I won't fail you." Later that evening, I called Mr. Hastings. "I'm ready," I told him. "Then we begin," he replied. The next days blurred with funeral arrangements, phone calls, and formalities. My cousins appeared, with perfect timing, expressing dramatic grief as though performing for an invisible audience. Ethan hugged me with the shallow warmth of a politician greeting a voter. "I know you took good care of him," he said, voice dripping with faux sincerity. "He appreciated you." I said nothing. Silence is often the only armor needed. He stepped back, eyeing the house. "So, do we meet with the lawyer soon?" I assume Grandpa had things in place. He did. "And I assume," he added casually, "he left things fair." Fair. Interesting choice of word. Leah cried through the service, though I noticed she never once looked at Grandpa's photo. Riley looked genuinely heartbroken. I made a mental note to speak with him privately at some point. He wasn't part of the betrayal, but he would be affected by the outcome. The official trust reading was scheduled for the following Tuesday. The night before, I sat at home surrounded by documents, reviewing everything one last time, not out of doubt, but out of respect. Grandpa had handed me a task that demanded precision and integrity. When I finally closed the folder, I felt something I hadn't expected. Strength. Steady, quiet strength. This wasn't revenge. This was accountability. This was truth given structure. And if Ethan wanted to claim the legacy he believed the world owed him, he would have to walk through every dishonest step he'd taken. I slept deeply that night, knowing that dawn would bring the beginning of an ending Ethan could not escape. But I wasn't prepared for how he would react when the lawyer read the first page of the trust, or the outburst that would reveal just how desperate he truly was. When Tuesday arrived, the conference room at Hastings and Lowell smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books. My cousins gathered around the table, Ethan sitting across from me with an air of smug expectation. Mr. Hastings began with the formalities, his voice steady, deliberate. Then he turned to the section that named the trustee. "The sole trustee appointed," he read, "is Margaret Ellison." Leah gasped softly. Riley raised his eyebrows in surprise. Ethan snorted. "What? Her? That's ridiculous." He leaned forward. "Grandpa wouldn't do that. She manipulated him." Mr. Hastings adjusted his glasses. "There is no evidence of manipulation. And your grandfather documented his reasoning in detail." He opened the second folder, the one that contained the evidence of Ethan's actions. "Before we continue with distributions, there are matters that must be addressed." Ethan stiffened. "What matters?" Mr. Hastings slid the first document forward. "We have records of unauthorized transfers totaling $11,870 from your grandfather's account to one under your name." Color drained from Ethan's face. "You can't prove that was me." "We can," Mr. Hastings said. "IP address logs, ATM footage, and handwriting analysis all confirm your involvement." Leah looked horrified. "Ethan, you told me Grandpa gave you permission." He swallowed hard, but Mr. Hastings wasn't done. "These forged signatures," he continued, placing the forms on the table, "constitute financial exploitation of an elder. Your grandfather chose not to pursue charges while alive, but he amended his trust to address the consequences." He turned to the relevant page. "Any beneficiary found to have manipulated, exploited, or stolen from me shall have their portion reduced or revoked entirely." Ethan's voice cracked. "You can't do this, Margaret. You can't let them read that." But I didn't say a word. My silence was a mirror, forcing him to look at himself. Mr. Hastings continued. "Based on the evidence, Your grandfather revoked your inheritance. You will receive nothing from the trust." The room went absolutely still. Ethan's chair scraped violently as he stood. "This is a setup. She's wanted to cut me out for years." I met his eyes for the first time since the funeral. "You did that to yourself." He shook his head, desperate. "I can fix this. Margaret, just tell him you don't want this. Tell him you'll split things fairly." Fairly. Again that word he loved to misuse. "The trust is irrevocable," I said softly. "Grandpa ensured that." Mr. Hastings added, "Attempting to contest it will only bring more scrutiny to your actions. You may wish to avoid that." Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. His throat worked as he swallowed what little pride he had left. Riley finally spoke. "You took money from a dying man, Ethan. What did you think would happen?" Ethan glared at all of us, chest heaving. Then he grabbed his coat and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. His downfall wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fiery or explosive. It was silent. It was slow. It was self-made. And as the door stopped shaking, the room exhaled as though releasing years of tension. But the aftermath, what happened in the weeks that followed, revealed the true cost of truth. And the unexpected freedom that comes with it. In the days after the trust meeting, quiet returned to my life in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not the heavy quiet of grief, but a gentler one, like the hush after a storm when the air is finally clear enough to breathe again. Riley called me 2 days later. "I didn't know," he said, "about any of it. If Grandpa had asked, I would have helped." "I know," I told him. He knew too. We talked about Grandpa for nearly an hour, about his stubbornness, his dry humor, the way he'd hum old jazz tunes when he thought no one could hear. Riley cried softly at one point, and I let him. Grief is its own language. Leah reached out as well. Her voice was shaky. "I don't know how I didn't see what Ethan was doing," she said. "I feel ashamed." "Don't carry shame that isn't yours," I replied. "But learn from it. Grandpa wanted us to do better." She promised she would. Ethan, predictably, avoided all of us. Word drifted through the family grapevine that he'd tried to secure a loan for his failing business and had been denied. His girlfriend left shortly after that. Apparently she'd been expecting a financial windfall from his imminent inheritance. When it evaporated, so did she. Meanwhile, I took on my responsibilities as trustee with a sense of solemn duty. The trust provided for upkeep of the house, charitable donations Grandpa had specified, and fair distributions to the cousins who had acted with integrity. But more than the logistics, I found myself tending to the emotional landscape Grandpa left behind. I began sorting through his belongings. Each item carried a story: the cane he'd carved himself, the cufflinks Grandma gave him on their 40th anniversary, the letters they wrote during his military service, still tied with a frayed blue ribbon. One afternoon, as I sat on the floor of his study surrounded by memory-laden boxes, I felt a deep, grounding peace settle through me. Caring for him had never been about inheritance. It had been about love, the kind that strengthens you without your realizing it. But something else happened that surprised me. I started rebuilding my own life. I joined a local walking group for widows and retirees. I took a watercolor class downtown. I even dusted off the piano in my living room, the one I hadn't touched since my husband died. The keys were cool beneath my fingers, but the sound was warm. Grief and justice had carved out space for renewal. One evening, while leaving the grocery store, I saw Ethan sitting alone in his car. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, shrunken in a way that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with consequence. He didn't see me, and I didn't approach him. Some reckonings don't require a witness. As I drove home, I realized something profound. I didn't hate him. I didn't even pity him. I simply understood him. Or rather, I understood the emptiness inside him that made him believe other people's lives existed for his benefit. And I understood that Grandpa hadn't chosen me as trustee because he wanted revenge. He'd chosen me because he wanted peace. Peace for himself. Peace for our family. Peace for the future. And in the final weeks of managing his affairs, I found something I thought I'd lost long ago. Peace for myself. But the true moral, the lesson that carried through every quiet moment, didn't reveal itself until much later. If age teaches anything, it's that justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like truth arriving at the exact moment a person can no longer outrun it. In the months following Grandpa's passing, I kept returning to one particular memory. A conversation we'd had on his porch during a warm autumn evening, long before he became ill. He'd leaned back in his chair, arms folded, and said, "People show you who they are when they think you need something from them. But they reveal who they really are when they need something from you." At the time, I thought he meant it as a general observation about human nature. But now, in the quiet clarity of everything that unfolded, I understood he had been preparing me, gently, patiently, for the responsibility he would one day place in my hands. The moral of this story isn't about an inheritance. It isn't about catching someone in a lie, or exposing wrongdoing, or watching a betrayal unravel under its own weight. It's about knowing the difference between kindness and being used. It's about recognizing that loyalty without reciprocity is not loyalty, it's self-erasure. It's about having the courage to stand quietly, firmly, in the center of truth, even when others call your integrity an agenda. For years, Ethan mocked me for visiting Grandpa. He saw care as weakness. He saw presence as manipulation. He saw love as currency. And that was his downfall. Not my actions. Not the trust. Not the documents. His character failed him long before anything else did. Being named trustee didn't give me power. It gave me responsibility. And fulfilling that responsibility became an act of both love and liberation. What I hope people understand, what I hope younger generations hear when they watch or listen to this story, is this. Life rewards consistency, even when no one is watching. Integrity pays dividends that money never can. And caring for someone at their most vulnerable is not only noble, it is transformative. One afternoon, months later, I sat on the porch of Grandpa's house, now preserved exactly as he wished, and listened to the wind move through the willow trees. I thought about the journey we had taken together, how love had deepened, how truth had revealed itself, how justice had unfolded with quiet precision. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt grateful. Grateful that I had been there for him when he needed someone. Grateful that he trusted me with the truth. Grateful that dignity had won out over entitlement. If there is a single message I would pass on to anyone listening, it is this. Do the right thing when no one is keeping score. Because eventually, the truth keeps its own. Family may fail you. People may misjudge you. But character, steady, patient character, becomes its own protection. And when the day comes that truth demands a witness, you will be able to stand in the light without flinching. That, more than inheritance, more than victory, is what real legacy looks like. And it is the legacy Grandpa entrusted to me. The story ends here, but its lesson continues. Quiet, steady, durable, just like the kind of love that shaped it.